Hollywood, a name that shines like diamonds, red carpets, blinding spotlights, and legends we carved into our hearts. But what if all that brilliance was only a beautiful mask? What if the heroes who shaped generations were actually hiding darkness far more terrifying than any film noir? Ron Howard, the man who grew up behind the studio gates, learned that truth long before the world dared to question it. From child actor to Oscar-winning director, he witnessed everything the world never saw. Power games, stories of cruelty, the price of silence, and secrets drenched in sin. The golden age wasn't golden, he once said. It was simply very skilled at washing away the blood. And tonight, that curtain finally falls. We are about to reveal 6 Hollywood legends whose charming smiles hid the brutality that studios protected. Powerful men covered up, and a system designed to silence victims buried for decades. This isn't a rumor. This isn't gossip. This is documented truth, court files, sworn testimonies, and real confessions. So now I ask you only one question. Are you ready to see the true faces of the monsters hiding behind Hollywood's brightest dreams? The charming predators. When smiles became weapons, before we name names, understand the system that protects them. Hollywood's studio era from the 1920s through 1960s wasn't just about making movies, it was about manufacturing gods. Studios like MGM, Warner Brothers, and Paramount owned actors through 7-year contracts that controlled everything. Who they dated, what they wore, what they said publicly. Your entire existence became their property. And if you made them millions, you became untouchable. That's where the fixers came in. Men like Eddie Mannix at MGM existed for one purpose: make problems disappear. An actor killed someone while drunk driving, bribed the police, pay off witnesses, rewrite the accident report. A star assaulted someone? Settle quietly with cash and legal threats. A scandal about to break? Plant a bigger story to distract the press. Ron Howard has described this machinery with barely contained rage. People romanticize old Hollywood, but it was just organized crime with better lighting. They didn't protect art, they protected assets. Our first subject perfected this dark art. Born in Tasmania in 1909, he arrived in Hollywood with athletic prowess and devastating charm. His 1935 breakthrough made him an overnight sensation, the ultimate adventure hero, swinging swords and stealing hearts. For a decade, he was box office gold. America was in the Great Depression, desperate for escape, and he provided it. Dashing, reckless, charming, he embodied everything romantic about manhood. Women wanted him. Men wanted to be him. But behind that dashing smile lurked something predatory. The mask slipped in 1942 when 2 teenage girls came forward with assault accusations. The trial became a media circus. Newspapers sold out daily. Fans mobbed courthouses refusing to believe their hero could be guilty. And him? He laughed through testimony, made jokes to reporters, treated the whole thing like a publicity stunt he could spin in his favor. His studio deployed an army of elite lawyers. Witnesses mysteriously changed stories or vanished completely. Money flowed in dark corners. The verdict: not guilty. He walked out smirking like he'd won a game. But the game didn't end there. It got worse. Private letters surfacing decades after his death revealed a man who bragged about his conquests, mocked his victims, genuinely believed fame made him a different species, operating under different rules. He wrote about women like they were trophies to be collected and discarded. Ron Howard, studying this actor's work years later, had a devastating realization. Hollywood didn't just fail these women, it actively silenced them. Every executive, every lawyer, every producer became complicit in a system designed to protect powerful men at any cost. The actor's final years read like Greek tragedy. Alcohol ravaged his liver. Cocaine destroyed his body. He became bloated, paranoid, and broke. Friends abandoned him. Studios stopped calling. He died in 1959 at just 50. His autopsy revealing heart disease, cirrhosis, and stomach ulcers, the physical manifestation of decades of excess and cruelty. But as Howard noted, he died the way he lived, taking everything, giving nothing back except pain. This man became the blueprint proving that charm, profit, and beloved status could excuse anything. The formula was simple: create an image so powerful that the public refuses to believe the truth, even when staring directly at it. And it worked perfectly for decades. The tyrants of power, when rage became routine. If our first subject represented moral bankruptcy, the next group embodies fear as a management tool. These weren't charming predators. These were tyrants ruling through intimidation, violence, and absolute certainty that talent made them gods. Born dirt poor in 1916 to immigrant parents, our second subject should be an inspirational success story. He clawed from poverty through sheer willpower, becoming a producer, director, and star who built an empire and lived to 103. His journey from the slums to Hollywood royalty should be celebrated. And on the surface, it was. Awards, honors, standing ovations. But ask anyone who actually worked with him, and you hear different words: terrifying, explosive, impossible. Film sets became war zones when he arrived. Crew members learned to read his moods like soldiers anticipating incoming fire. Assistant directors developed signals to warn people when he was in a bad mood. Makeup artists drew straws to see who had to work with him. He didn't demand excellence, he demanded total submission. One actress who worked opposite him said something chilling. He didn't want to win the scene. He wanted to dominate every person in it. The performance wasn't enough. He needed to see fear in your eyes, off camera too. The tantrums were legendary and well documented. Equipment thrown across sets, causing thousands in damage. People verbally destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses, reduced to tears while he continued screaming. On one production, he allegedly grabbed a cinematographer by the collar and shoved him against a wall over a lighting disagreement. Even Stanley Kubrick, notoriously demanding himself and known for doing hundreds of takes, called him the hardest person I've ever tried to control. Think about that. Kubrick, who made Shelley Duvall do 127 takes of a single scene, couldn't control him. That tells you everything about the level of rage and ego we're dealing with here. But the darkest part isn't the tantrums. Its allegations surfaced after a young actress's death in the 1980s. Claims about a 1950s incident when she was just 16 years old. Her sister corroborated the story in a 2018 memoir, naming him specifically and providing disturbing details about how the assault allegedly occurred and how studio executives immediately worked to bury the story. He never faced charges. The story got buried under that same machinery, protecting powerful men. Ron Howard spoke about this with quiet fury. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. What it revealed in him was rage that never stopped burning, a belief that he had earned the right to do whatever he wanted to, whomever he wanted. He believed rules didn't apply to him, and Hollywood agreed, every single day, for 70 years. When he received an honorary Oscar in 1996, the standing ovation lasted several minutes. To most people watching at home, it celebrated a long and distinguished career. To Howard watching from the audience, it meant something else entirely. the industry congratulating itself for protecting him for 70 years. Every person standing and applauding was saying, "Your talent matters more than the people you destroyed." He died in 2020, outliving most of his accusers and critics. But accusations outlived him. Now, a new generation armed with social media and unwilling to stay silent asks questions the old generation refused to answer. Then, there's the woman proving cruelty wasn't male exclusive. Born in 1941 in the Deep South, she exploded onto screens in the late 1960s with supernatural beauty and talent. Icy, magnetic, untouchable. Her breakthrough performance made critics compare her to the greatest actresses in cinema history. Her work in several landmark films throughout the 1970s established her as cinema royalty. She seemed to glide through roles other actresses could only dream of landing. But excellence became her excuse for cruelty, and perfection became her weapon. Film set stories are remarkably consistent across decades and productions. Assistants reduced to tears, then fired for crying. Makeup artists screamed at for hours over imperceptible flaws. Entire productions held hostage to demands about lighting, camera angles, even the specific temperature of her trailer down to the exact degree. One director seriously considered abandoning a multi-million-dollar production halfway through because she made it unbearable. Every day felt like psychological warfare, he later confessed. You'd show up not knowing if you'd face the charming professional or the monster. Supreme irony came with her most iconic role, playing a Hollywood legend infamous for abusing adopted children. While portraying cruelty on camera, she reportedly mirrored that exact behavior behind it. The director later confessed the line between character and actress became terrifyingly thin. Sometimes I couldn't tell if she was acting or if the character had given her permission to be who she really was. Method acting taken to a disturbing extreme. During one international production, she allegedly struck a crew member who couldn't adjust lighting fast enough for her liking. In another film, she humiliated assistants so severely that production shut down an entire day for emotional recovery. The production company had to bring in counselors. Her former manager, speaking years after their professional relationship ended, said, "She doesn't play divas. She is one. Not the glamorous kind you see in movies. The genuinely cruel kind who gets pleasure from watching people break." Ron Howard uses her as a teaching example when discussing on-set behavior with young filmmakers. Talent without empathy isn't art, it's tyranny. She confused pursuing perfection with permission to destroy people. Real artists lift people up. She ground them down. By the 2000s, her reputation finally caught up with her. The directors stopped calling. Studios wouldn't hire her regardless of her name recognition. A Broadway revival ended with her being fired mid-run, almost unheard of for an Oscar winner. The producers released a carefully worded statement about creative differences, but everyone in the industry knew what it really meant. When asked about the firing, she blamed everyone else, the director who didn't understand her process, producers who were intimidated by real talent, and the younger generation's weakness and inability to handle pressure. She never understood that the industry hadn't changed. She'd simply exhausted the supply of people willing to be abused for the privilege of working with an Oscar winner. And then, the ultimate American icon. No figure looms larger over American cinema than this man born in 1907 in Iowa. He became more than an actor. He became ideology itself. The rugged individualist, the frontier hero, the soldier who always did his duty, the man who stood for something when everyone else was sitting down. For millions worldwide, He represented everything mythic about masculinity and patriotism. His films defined what it meant to be an American man for multiple generations. But the myth was exactly that, a carefully constructed lie maintained by studios, publicists, and a complicit media. On film sets, he ruled through intimidation and humiliation. Technicians making mistakes got cursed at publicly, their competence questioned in front of the entire crew. Fellow actors challenging him on interpretation or blocking were frozen out of scenes or blacklisted from future projects. One actor who worked with him on multiple westerns said, "When he was angry, everyone stopped breathing. The entire set would go silent. You either submitted completely or you got destroyed. And he would destroy you. He'd make sure you never worked in this town again." His cruelty extended far beyond professional settings. He was notorious for mocking indigenous actors during westerns, reinforcing the exact stereotypes those performers were desperately trying to escape. He would make jokes about Indians between takes, refused to learn their actual names, and lobbied against giving them speaking roles because he claimed audiences wouldn't believe it. He belittled women openly, treating actresses like props that should stand where told and say their lines without input. He dismissed black performers, pushing back against racist roles, calling them ungrateful for the opportunities Hollywood was giving them. Then came his 1971 magazine interview, revealing who he actually was beneath the cowboy hat. The quotes remain shocking 5 decades later. Deeply bigoted views about Native Americans being selfish for wanting ancestral lands, African Americans not being ready for equal rights, claims that slavery was actually beneficial, dismissals of the civil rights movement as communist infiltration, weakening traditional American values. When these comments resurfaced decades later during increased awareness of Hollywood's problematic past, they forced a long-overdue reckoning with his legacy. Ron Howard, who studied one of his most celebrated performances in film school, had a disturbing realization. You can't separate the character from the actor. The racism on screen wasn't acting, it was belief. Every bigoted moment in his westerns was him, not the script. He was playing himself and getting celebrated for it. Even dying of cancer in the late 1970s, he never apologized. He gave interviews blaming political correctness and a soft generation that didn't understand what made America great. He blamed liberals, feminists, minorities demanding equal treatment, everyone except himself. He died in 1979, still lionized by millions who chose to see only the myth. But Howard sees a different legacy. Power built on prejudice doesn't mature into wisdom. It rots into bitterness. And the tragedy is that millions of people built their entire idea of manhood on a foundation of hate. Multiple generations learned what it meant to be a man from someone who believed women were inferior and people of color were less than human. The Untouchables. When genius became a shield for evils. Our final 2 subjects represent perhaps Hollywood's greatest moral failure. Willingness to separate artistic brilliance from monstrous actions, to applaud the art while ignoring the destroyed lives behind it. The first was born in Paris in 1933, a Nazi-occupied Europe survivor who seemed marked by tragedy from birth. His mother died in Auschwitz. His childhood was defined by hiding, running, surviving. He arrived in Hollywood carrying unimaginable trauma, and his early films reflected that darkness. He established himself as a unique voice, transforming psychological horror and paranoia into visual poetry. Critics called him a genius. Other directors studied his technique. Film students memorized his shots. Then came March 1977, and everything changed. The details are public record. documented in court filings and police reports. A 13-year-old girl, a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's house, overwhelming evidence including the victim's testimony and physical evidence, a guilty plea to a lesser charge of unlawful intercourse with a minor. Then, before sentencing, knowing he faced significant prison time, he fled the country to France, a nation that wouldn't extradite him. He never returned to the United States. For Ron Howard, then a young filmmaker trying to establish himself and deeply inspired by this director's visual style, the industry's reaction was devastating. They talked about art. They debated whether his trauma from the Holocaust excused his actions. They worried about his career, his legacy, his emotional state, whether prison would destroy his creative genius. Almost nobody talked about her, the 13-year-old girl whose life was shattered, who had to live knowing her rapist was free, celebrated, still making movies and winning awards. The moral stain deepened over decades. He continued directing abroad, winning awards, receiving standing ovations at international film festivals. Actors lined up to work with him despite, or perhaps because of, his notoriety. In 2003, he won an Academy Award for Best Director. The Dolby Theatre audience rose to applaud, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Everyone except Ron Howard, who remained seated while people around him stared. "I thought about that girl," he said in an interview years later. 13 years old and alone, testifying in court about what he did to her, and then watching him escape consequences. "I wondered how applause sounds to survivors when the person who hurt them gets celebrated, when the industry chooses his artistic vision over her destroyed innocence." The debate raged for years in think pieces and film journals. Can we separate art from artist? Is genius its own morality? Should talent grant immunity? Does great art justify terrible actions? For Howard, the answer is unambiguous and immediate. If your art costs a child's innocence, your art isn't worth defending. I don't care how beautiful your shots are or how profound your themes are. A child was raped. Everything else is noise. When this director won another major European award in 2020, protesters walked out of the ceremony. Actresses who had previously worked with him released statements condemning the honor. To Howard, that moment represented hope arriving late, but still arriving. Justice delayed is still justice. It took 40 years for the industry to say what should have been said immediately, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous because he knows how to frame a shot, because he understands lighting, because critics write essays about his symbolism. He remains in exile, legally untouchable in Europe, artistically defended by many who argue we must separate art from artist, that condemning his films somehow diminishes cinema itself. For Ron Howard, his story embodies everything poisonous about Hollywood's golden age mentality that never truly ended. An industry that protects artists and abandons victims, that values talent over humanity, that forgives anything, absolutely anything, as long as the lighting is good and the box office is better. The message sent by continuing to celebrate his work is clear. Artistic genius matters more than the children destroyed to create it. Our final actor represents a different tragedy. What happens when fame arrives too early and damages something irreparable inside, when a child becomes a product before becoming a person. Born in 1920, he became Hollywood's first true child superstar, performing in vaudeville before he could read. By 18, he was America's highest-paid actor, making more money than executives running the studios. His musicals defined an era. His smile became iconic. MGM built an empire on his cheerful all-American persona. But that persona was a prison constructed around him from childhood. Inside it, something dark grew, twisted by fame, pressure, and being treated as a commodity rather than a human being. 8 marriages, all ending in betrayal or disaster. Each wife described similar patterns: initial charm giving way to jealousy, possessiveness, emotional cruelty. Compulsive gambling destroyed fortunes as fast as he made them. Public humiliation of partners and friends, tearing them down to build himself up. One ex-wife, herself a legendary actress who defined glamour for a generation, described him as having an enormous ego despite, or because of, his short stature, constantly needing to prove his dominance. His on-screen charm that made millions fall in love became off-screen cruelty that destroyed everyone close to him. His closest friend during MGM years, another child star whose life ended tragically young, destroyed by pills, pressure, and abuse from studio executives, hinted in private conversations that he contributed to her suffering. Not just the studio heads who force-fed her amphetamines and sleeping pills, controlled her weight obsessively, and manipulated every aspect of her life, but him too, with volatile moods and emotional manipulation. Former co-stars described him as capable of making you laugh one moment and destroying you the next, switching between charm and cruelty so fast you got emotional whiplash. By the 1960s, his career collapsed under the weight of addiction, debt, and scandal. Younger audiences didn't want the wholesome musicals that made him famous. He couldn't transition to dramatic roles. He declared bankruptcy multiple times. In a brutally honest 1979 interview conducted in his small apartment, he claimed to have lived 1,000 lives across his 7 decades. But as Ron Howard later reflected, he lived them all for himself, every single one, and left wreckage behind. Broken marriages, damaged children, destroyed friendships. He consumed people. Even in his final years, facing accusations of financial exploitation and elder abuse from his own family members who claimed he was being manipulated by his last wife, he blamed everyone but himself. Studios that used him as a child, wives who wanted his money, children who didn't understand him, the industry that created him, then abandoned him when he was no longer profitable. When he died in 2014 at 93, his estate was worth less than $20,000, remarkable for someone who'd earned millions across his career. His body initially went unclaimed until friends raised money for a modest funeral, a heartbreaking end for someone who had once been the most famous child in America. For Ron Howard, this ending completed a devastating pattern. He made the world laugh while dying inside. Maybe that's the saddest kind of evil. When pain becomes performance, when suffering becomes entertainment, and nobody notices until far too late. We celebrated the product and ignored the person. And when that person hurt others from his own pain, we looked away because we wanted to keep enjoying the product. His story represents the final piece of Hollywood's golden age puzzle. The child consumed by the machine that made him a star, who then consumed others in turn because that's what he learned. The cycle of abuse, trauma, and exploitation defining an entire era of American cinema. Studios created these monsters through child labor, exploitation, and treating human beings as assets, then acted surprised when those children grew into damaged adults who perpetuated the cycle. Ron Howard didn't share these stories for revenge, clicks, or controversy. He shared them because silence enabled this in the first place, and silence continues, enabling it today. The golden age of Hollywood we romanticize with sepia-toned nostalgia and Turner Classic Movies marathons was built on exploitation, protected by silence, sustained by collective agreement to never look too closely at our heroes. The scariest monsters aren't in horror films, Howard said in a recent documentary interview. They're the ones standing in spotlights receiving applause while their victims watch from shadows, voiceless and forgotten. These 6 actors, the predator, the tyrant, the ice queen, the bigot, the fugitive, and the broken child, represent different expressions of the same poison, showing what happens when talent excuses cruelty, when fame grants immunity, when profit matters more than people, and when silence becomes complicity. But here's the haunting question that should keep us awake. Has anything fundamentally changed? Or have we just gotten better at public relations? Better at hiding the same patterns behind legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements? The Me Too movement proved powerful abusers still operate in Hollywood with shocking frequency. Victims are still doubted, attacked, and dismissed, while perpetrators remain protected by lawyers, publicists, and industry gatekeepers. Careers still matter more than consequences. The machinery upgraded from fixers to crisis management firms, from cash payoffs to ironclad NDAs, from burying stories to controlling narratives, but the principle remains identical. Protect the asset, silence the victim, move to the next project, keep the money flowing. Ron Howard believes in redemption. Most of his films explore second chances and human complexity, characters finding their way back from moral failure. But he also believes redemption requires accountability first, that you can't have forgiveness without acknowledgement of harm. Accountability requires refusing to forget, refusing to excuse, refusing to separate genius from the damage it caused. It requires saying clearly, your talent doesn't excuse what you did. Your awards don't erase your victims. Your legacy includes both the art you created and the lives you destroyed. So here's what I'm asking you to do, and I'm asking seriously because this matters. Don't just watch this video and move on to the next piece of content. Don't let this become just another data point in your endless scroll. Think deeply about the movies you love, the actors you admire, the legends you've been taught to worship without question. Ask yourself uncomfortable questions. What am I willing to overlook in pursuit of entertainment? What am I willing to excuse because someone is talented? At what point does talent stop being worth the human cost? At what point do we say that some actions should end careers regardless of artistic genius? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and I genuinely want to hear them. Which of these 6 shocked you most? Which patterns do you see repeating in today's industry? Can you think of current examples of this same machinery protecting powerful people? What can we, as audiences, as consumers, as people who fund this industry with our attention, money, and cultural capital, do to demand better? Your voice matters more than you think. Your awareness matters. This conversation happening right now in this comment section matters because change begins with people refusing to stay silent. Hit that subscribe button if you want more investigations into Hollywood's hidden history, more stories the industry doesn't want told, more truth behind the glamour. I'm committed to bringing you content that doesn't just entertain, but educates. That doesn't confirm what you already believe, but challenges you to think deeper, question harder, demand more from the art you consume and the artists you celebrate. Share this video with someone who loves classic films, not to ruin their enjoyment, but to complicate it, to add context, to remind them that art doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's made by human beings capable of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes in the same person, sometimes in the same day. The Golden Age was never really golden. It just had better lighting, better publicity, better silence, and fewer ways for victims to tell their stories. But silence ends when we refuse to be quiet anymore. When we demand that talent doesn't excuse torture, that genius doesn't grant immunity, that legacy doesn't erase victims, that awards don't absolve abuse. Ron Howard ended his acting career and became a filmmaker because he wanted to tell honest stories about complicated people. He spent 5 decades balancing his love for cinema with understanding its costs, celebrating its beauty while acknowledging its capacity for cruelty. Maybe that's the balance we all need to find. Loving movies while refusing to love the mythology that protected monsters. Appreciating art while holding artists accountable. The truth doesn't care about nostalgia, box office receipts, standing ovations, or legacy. The truth doesn't care if acknowledging it makes us uncomfortable or ruins our favorite films. The truth only cares about being told. And once it's told, once it's heard, once it's believed, everything changes. These 6 names defined an era, shaped what multiple generations believed about heroism, romance, masculinity, and success. But they don't have to define the future. That's up to us. That's up to you. So let's start talking, questioning, demanding that the industry we love finally becomes worthy of that love. Because the real golden age of Hollywood hasn't happened yet. But it could, if we're brave enough to build it on truth instead of silence, courageous enough to hold our heroes accountable, wise enough to understand that great art should never require human sacrifice. What do you think? Tell me in the comments. Challenge me. Disagree with me. Share your perspective because that's how change begins. With conversation, with honesty, with refusal to accept this is just how things are, or you have to separate art from artist. I'll be reading every single comment, engaging with your thoughts, continuing this conversation because it's too important to let die. Hit that like button if this video made you think differently about Hollywood's history. Share it on your social media. Send it to that friend who constantly talks about the good old days of cinema, when movies were better and stars were real stars. Let's make sure these stories don't get buried again. Make sure victims aren't forgotten. Make sure the next generation of filmmakers learns from these mistakes instead of repeating them. Thank you for watching, for caring, for being willing to see the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, and challenges what you believed. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue pulling back the curtain on the industry that shaped our dreams, for better and for worse.